Okay, I'm going to show you how to do the first dart manipulation for the single dart series, the center front waist dart. So what we're doing is starting with our block that we made. Remember, we took our basic block sloper and we gave the bottom to the dart so that we can see where that excess needs to go, right? So that it looks nice down here. And then what I did is traced this onto like the back of cardboard box so that I can just have a heavier piece of paper so that I'm not tracing from this flimsy piece of paper. Okay, so I laid it down, I traced all around it, and then I cut away my lines so you don't see any lines. I did not cut on the line like I did when I was first cutting this out, because by tracing over it, I'm adding that much more with my pencil line. So I cut away my lines and then I transferred all the markings over. So it says bodice front. I've still got this notch up here, which would be like where a sleeve would go. I went ahead and put notches here on my dart legs. I put on the grain line, which is going to be very helpful to tell me which way to put this. And then when I transferred the dart legs, I went ahead and brought my dart all the way up, it's kind of hard to see because I wrote all over it, to my apex, to my bust point. Remember, we dropped this, or it came automatically dropped from the bust point because nobody wants a sharp dart pointing right at the bust point. They want it a little bit off so it looks a little smoother on the body. But honestly, when I'm going to be changing this shape all around, I want to radiate from that point. So after I traced it, and again, I used my pencil to kind of poke a little hole here so that I could transfer the dot, which is how I got the dot here. I just drew the legs from that point, from the bottom up to that point. So I just took it up where I need it to be, okay? So now this is my final block, or my sloper, that I can use for all my other exercises. I've got my textbook out, and I'm open to the center front waist dart page, wherever that is on whatever version of the textbook you have. I have the 4th edition, and it's page 70. It's in chapter 4. It's the very first one, so really easy, hopefully, to find. And it kind of shows you an image of what it should look like, say it was all sewn up. So I'm going to follow along with this, but the first thing I want to do is get a piece of notebook paper and trace my sloper. You don't have to, but it might be a good idea, because it's what I would do if I was using real pattern paper, is to take this, really straight edge and keep it parallel to this really straight edge. Like, there's just really no reason to turn it unless you think you're going to run off the end of the page, something like that. So I just kind of keep that in mind when I'm doing it, just to understand exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to trace this, and see now, by using the heavier cardboard, it's a lot easier to trace. I can just run my pencil along the side, and I'm just using my hand to hold it down. To get this notch, what I'll do is I come right out into the outside here, knowing that I'll erase that and put it back on the inside. You could also take your scissors and clip into that notch right there so that you can get into that groove. Maybe I'll do that and show you what I mean. I'm going to trace this, whoops, and if it moves a little bit, just put it right back into place. You can use like a big heavy paperweight or something if you want, but you want to try to trace this as accurately as possible. Okay, so I've got that traced, right, like my basic outline. And let me show you what I meant by putting the little notches. You can take your scissors and just do a little notch, and maybe you can get in there now with your pencil every time. And then a little notch right there. So let's see if I can go back here and transfer that marking. Let's get it up here where you guys can see. So I'll put it right back into the same spot. You might be able to. Might need to make like a little larger of a scissor notch. Kind of can't do it too much. I kind of got in a little bit, so I could just take this and go, there we go, like cut it at an angle, see, so that I can make a slightly larger notch, and then pull out if I can, that excess. There we go. So see, I've made a little bit larger of a notch, like almost the tiniest little triangle. So that should be able to transfer that, okay? So now I could have those notches. Oh, and then what about this one? I could do this one up there. And then you're gonna have to punch a hole through this cardboard. I have an awl, which is made specifically for that. It's for like punching holes through wood and leather and things like that. But you can use whatever you can get to punch a little hole through there. You can use a ballpoint pen or something like that. But see how now I've got a little hole so that I can mark my bust point. And again, I'm lining this up perfectly. There we go. And I've got my point. And now I can redraw the dart legs. Come right off. And right off here. See how I do that? I just line up that point and draw a straight line. And again, I'll just put that where it needs to go. Put my little T so I know that that's a notch, and I could just make that circle a little bigger there so that I remember. And I could also transfer that green line just to get in the habit of always doing that. Okay, so now, oops, I've got my copy of my bodice front, okay? And what I want to do is take this opening, which is a dart that's on the princess line, kind of not the side seam, not the waist, but right in the center of those two, and I want to move it to the center front waist. And it shows you in the textbook exactly what to do, but this is, remember, the center front, and that is my waist. So I will, radiating off of my bust point, so lining up my ruler with that bust point and this center front waist, and I'll come straight down. So that is my new slash line, okay? This is where I want the dart to be. So what I'll do now is I'm gonna cut this right where I drew that line. Cut it kind of all the way up to that dot, but maybe not like through the dot, okay? So that's one slash. And now I cut one of these dart legs. It honestly doesn't matter which one. So we can pick one, and then the goal is not to cut all the way through it, but to kind of stop short of it. And if you do cut all the way through it, it's not the end of the world either, but I'll show you what I mean. So I'm gonna pick this one that's right here. And again, with this, you're cutting on the line, and I'm going almost all the way up there. And now I've got this like flap. So here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna take this old dart and close it. Just like I was sewing, I'm gonna bring this side to this side and close it. And if you did slice all the way through, you know, no big deal, you can still close it. Just put your piece, you know, right where it needs to be. And what I can do is get a little piece of tape of any kind, and I'll just tape that closed, okay? And now I have my new dart opening. Naturally happened for me. Okay, it just opens up, and that's kind of what we're gonna do with all these. We're gonna slash one of our dart legs, we're gonna slash our new style line, and we're just gonna pivot the thing around, and it tells you exactly how much space needs to open in the new spot, sort of to make that fit, okay? And then what's important to note here is that this, I actually don't need. See how like it's open just this tiny amount, but before it was so big? Because I slashed on this side, like this doesn't exist anymore, right? In fact, what we can do to kind of, I can really highlight that, you can slash both sides of the dart. So I can show you kind of that this dart goes away. And that's how it shows you in the book too, so hopefully I'm not confusing you too terribly much. Okay, so now I have this like gone, right? And again, I come back over here with my old dart and close it back up. There we go. And now I have a much larger kind of dart opening, similar to what I had originally, which makes more sense. Okay, so if you look at it and it looks like really different, that's what happened. So I just got rid of all of, I'm gonna just even rip it out if I don't rip my paper apart. I got rid of that dart, and I've got this one. And again, that's why I say if you cut it out completely, no big deal, just line it up so that you've closed it. I'm even gonna use 2 little pieces of tape because mine's trying to move on me. Get it all good. Line it up there. Okay, and now you've got your new shape. So now, third step, you'll go through a little bit of paper, you trace it once. This is your worksheet, okay? You can save that to come back to it. For example, like sometimes you might make another slight change. This is your original. But if we know this is the change we want to make, what we can do now is trace the whole thing. So what I'll actually do now is cut out the whole thing. And I'll cut away my pencil line. Okay, and that way you know you're getting an accurate cut because you're not adding a tiny, 1/16 of an inch every time, or however big your pencil line is. I just cut away my pencil line, which is why it's also really important to take the time to make sure all of your notches are transferred to the inside of your pattern before you start cutting them off. Once you cut them off, you won't be able to see where they are anymore. So, cutting away. And then with this, I can just sort of smooth it out. You kind of see here, it kind of goes, like it looks like it's a little bent. If that happens, you could take your ruler, like your French curve, and kind of curve it. Or again, when I'm cutting it, I feel like this is honestly close enough that I can just cut it at that soft curve, to kind of create that shape, right? And now if you kind of see, from the back, it looks smoother, okay? So this is now my new pattern shape that I'm gonna trace, okay? So again, I can line that up. And now you are tracing from a tiny little piece of notebook paper, so you'll have to be super careful. Oops, you could always take your cardboard piece and place it over and trace from most of it, since we really only made a change down here at the bottom. There we go, that's my nice smooth line. I can just make sure to, oh, you guys can't see me down there. I got down here, and I'm just kind of tracing. I don't need to trace all of this right now. I'm just kind of tracing a little bit of it. You can trace all of it if you want your whole dart leg, but I'm just giving myself that mark. And then don't forget to transfer your bust point and transfer your notch. Okay, so let's come and look and see what we've got. Oh, I don't think my bust point came through because I don't really see anything in the middle here, so let's put it right back and make sure we got that. There we go. There we go. So now, again, like I said, you could have traced that line right away, or I could just trace it now. From my bust point down to the bottom of what is the new dart leg. Okay, we've got everything else in here. And then here's what we have to do. This is almost done, but again, going back to that original block that we had, where from our bust point, which is here, since it's hard to see, let me erase some of this that I've scribbled on it. From our bust point that is here, again, it was dropped a small amount so that it didn't point right to the breast. It's dropped about, let's say, 1/4 of an inch, okay? So we're actually gonna do the same thing. Let's get into the habit of doing that. So we're gonna drop it 1/4 of an inch. And what I do is I look for the center. So I am taking my ruler, right? I'm lining the 1/4 of an inch mark, this line, right on top of that bust point. And I'm looking for the center of these 2 legs, which I think is what I have. So see how I have that? See how here was my original bust point and dropped down centered in this triangle that it's creating is my new bust point. 1/4 of an inch down, okay? And then now I draw what ends up being my final legs, coming from that new bust point, or what now is the dart point, and the dart legs, okay? So you can erase this, or you can leave it because it is obvious what it is. I don't really mind. Like in a final pattern, you wouldn't see this anymore. You would just see the new point. Sometimes I just draw this really lightly. See how it's a lot lighter than my others, so that, you know, I can erase it so that you've got options. It wouldn't kill me if I see it, because then I know that you've dropped the dart, so that kind of makes me happy. So you can go ahead and leave it, but again, you're dropping 1/4 of an inch from that bust point down right into the center and drawing new dart legs. And then again, you can just make sure that all of your lines were traced nicely on your new pattern. This is where, like I say, you can go back either with your ruler or your cardboard piece and make sure we can really see your lines well. You'll definitely want to move this notch to the inside, okay? So you just that you can see it. And then we'll have notches down here. We'll transfer our grain line. And again, this line is so light anyway, so I might just redraw it so that it's really obvious. And this would be, whoopsie, this would be our new pattern piece. Ooh, that moved a little on me. But what this pattern piece is missing, oh yeah, and the grain line, let's put that on there too, while we're right over here. And again, has arrowheads on each. We could label this now. So this is, and a lot of times what I actually do is write all my information on this grain line. It kind of gives me a place to write it. So center, front, waist, dart. Okay, it's kind of sloppy. You could do your name. I'll write my initials, AB. And then you could also write, you know, what this is, which is the bodice front, in case you had multiple pattern pieces and you had to tell them apart. So that's what I'm looking for. Your name, the name of the actual pattern, and the name of the pattern piece. So it'll always be your name and bodice front in these, and then you'll just change what the pattern name is from time to time, okay? The last thing we're going to do, because now we have our new pattern, but this doesn't have any seam allowance on it. When we see these blocks and slopers, it's without any seam allowance added, because in each different design you might have a different amount of seam allowance that you add. So you always do that afterwards. So in this case, we're going to add seam allowance to all the sides so that we could sew it up. And then we can make some decisions, right? So because this is the center front, this center front might not have seam allowance. It might not have a seam there. It might be cut on fold. Remember when we used to do that? So in that case, remember, how do you do cut on fold? You come down with these lines, remember, and you have arrowheads that point to it. So in that case, you wouldn't have this arrowhead here or this here. You have your straight grain line, but then it turns at the corners and comes down and points to where it's cut on fold. And in that case, you actually write, you know, cut one on fold, or cut on fold, you know, so that you're really indicating what that means, okay? So in that case, this seam does not need seam allowance because it's cut on fold. The other seams still would, right? Like your shoulder seam up here, it would need seam allowance. And typically with the full scale pattern, we would add 1/2 of an inch, but because this is tiny, let's add 1/4 of an inch. So again, I'm taking the 1/4 of an inch from the edge of my ruler, that line, I'm placing it on my pencil line, and then I've easily added an exact 1/4 of an inch there. I'll just show you over here on this side seam. So I've got my straight side seam, I've taken my ruler 1/4 of an inch off of it, and I draw that line, and now I have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. For these rounded ones, you just have to pivot your ruler. So I'm going really nice and slow, I am using a big fat regular pencil here, but because I press so hard, if that isn't obvious, I usually use a mechanical pencil, and I suggest you use the same thing. I've actually got one right here, so maybe I'll start using that, because usually these are just a little easier to erase and you don't end up pressing as hard. And see how I'm just ever so slightly moving my ruler so that I'm still 1/4 of an inch from that original seam. I'm gonna go back in and fill in my kind of dotted lines. There we go. So you see how it's a little choppier than the other one. And then what happens is, because now that I've got seam allowance, this notch doesn't live on the inside anymore. It doesn't have to, and it shouldn't actually. So I'm getting rid, I've got the line that goes straight across, and now my notch lives in the seam allowance. So I can take my ruler and come and do a T cross inside the seam allowance. See, so when I would cut, this would be the outside, that would be the seam allowance where I'd sew, and that's where I'd make that notch, because I wouldn't want to cut into my real fabric. Remember, when we're sewing together, we don't want you to see, you just want to cut this little bit that only you can see when you're sewing, okay? So I've got that, and let me do my 1/4 of an inch down here. And I'm looking for areas that I can go, you know, long straight lines, and then areas where it's like a little rounded, I'll go nice and slow and pivot, okay? And now, oh, and I've got my neck. Something to think about is that at the neck, this is always like it would continue straight across right here. You wouldn't want there to be this weird tiny little V or something strange happening there if you put it on fold. So something to consider when you're adding your seam allowance, something that's cut on fold. It's like you might want to take that line all the way up just to start, to give you a good squared off point so that you have a nice shape when it opens up and it's on fold. And then I'm just pivoting my ruler around, trying to go really nice and lightly in case I sort of make a mistake in my pivot, which I often do. Okay, so now I've got seam allowance up there. What I like to do, and the book doesn't show this, I feel like it shows it pretty similarly, I like to continue my lines of my original seam all the way into the seam allowance. I'll show you what I mean. So like that, and like that, so that at each corner I have a really obvious corner of where I need to stop and really obvious what is seam allowance. For example, here where I have this corner, you know, and I don't continue my lines, it could be easy in a delicate situation to kind of mess this up and to get a slightly inaccurate shape. Okay, so by doing it this way, it's always very precise of where you need to sew. And that's really why I do it. There are some instances, and it's just one of those things, you'd come across it and you'd say, oh yes, this is exactly why it's nice to know that this is where you need to sew and that is where you not need to sew. So I always make it a habit of crossing off all my corners. Okay, so it's just continuing the line all the way. And it's just the practice of like neatening up your patterns, you know? So kind of after you've done the tracing and after you've got your right shape and you've transferred everything, you know, it's like going back through and just neatening them up and making it really obvious what's going on. So see how I've got a nice corner block here in all the different spaces. And then now, here's where I would come down to this dart, and remember how we did before when we did this one and we had to fold it to find the underlying dart shape? This is the only one we aren't gonna do that. We could do the same thing. We could fold it and get that underlying dart shape. I believe in this case we would go off the edge of the paper. And hey, no big deal if that happens. You can just literally like take some of your scrap and tape it, you know, and make the paper the right size. But in this case, because this is actually, we made it cut on fold, it would be really strange to have a big bunch of fabric tucked up into the center front of your garment on both sides, right? It'd be kind of weird. So this is a case where we'll actually just add seam allowance to the inside of our dart. So it kind of doesn't even end up being a dart at that point. It's almost like just a cutout if you think about it, okay? So I'm just gonna come all the way down and I'm adding 1/4 inch to that final line. Remember, not that line that we first drew. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on this side. Oops, oh my goodness, moving my ruler. There we go. And even here, I have a really obvious squared corner. I could see that here's where I would stop cutting, here's where I would sew, okay? When I get down here to the bottom, I'm just gonna neaten these up. And patterns, if you haven't already guessed it, I mean, these are basically blueprints for clothes. They have to be precise. Okay, so that looks nice and neat. And then this, because it is that center front, I can just draw it as a straight line, okay? So nice and neat. I believe everything's on there. I've got my grain line, I've got my name, my label, my pattern piece, and I even went ahead to say cut on fold, just as not to confuse you. I'm going to erase this where I said we dropped that 1/4 inch from that bust point. I could even erase these additional lines from when I first drew my dart and make it really nice and neat, right? But I've still got my bust point, which is nice, you know, reference again, just so I can see that you've done it. And what I would typically do in a pattern, which is why I go really big, is because then I would cut it out. And then I cut off all my ugly extra lines over here. That's what I typically would do. So you could do that, or if you, you know, you could just leave it on here and you can erase it and you could like clean these edges up. So it'll be your call. You can erase all your extras, extra little bits, and then just leave it on this nice notebook paper size because you can easily keep it in a folder or whatever. Or if you want, you can cut it out, because that's what you would do if you were gonna sew, right? You'd cut it and it would have to be like the actual size, and then you'd put it on fabric and all that. I think I got everything up there. Okay. And again, if you accidentally erased something, you can just go back. So this is my finished pattern. This is what it should look like. Nice and neat and mostly very precise. What I want you to do as a final step is, however you do this, you could do it on the pattern if you want, or you could do it up here in like some corner space off to the side. I want you to draw what this would look like if it was sewn up, similar to how they did here in the book. Because at the end of the day, when you're looking at this, like to quickly wrap your head around what this pattern piece actually ends up looking like, it's a little confusing. So it's nice if we have a reference. So just like they did here, you don't have to do it that fancy, right? We're just gonna do a really easy flat. So for example, like all of these, they're gonna start with a little neckline, shoulders, and they're fitted bodices, right? So here's my armholes. They'll all look like this. This is your basic bodice, right? Because these are fitted bodices. They nip in at the waist. They have this simple round neckline, simple round armhole. What I want to see is where the dart is. And we know that these darts now originate from center front, and they go up to the bust point. So this is what this looks like when you sew it up, because this would be cut on fold, so you don't have a seam down the center, and both of